Welcome, everybody, to the next iteration of the IITE seminars. It is my great pleasure to welcome Hal Caswell to the seminar series. If you don't know Hal, he is known for many things, but among other things, he's written a very important book. Yes, it's right there on the shelf. It belongs on the shelf of every theoretical ecologist on matrix population models. Today, he's going to be telling us, though, about demographic stochasticity and kinship. And without further ado, Hal, I'm very excited to hear you talk.
Okay, well, hello everybody. Those of you that I can see when I have the screen shared. Yeah, my plan is to talk about some recent things on demographic stochasticity in a particular model for the demography of kinship networks. This is a thing that I've been working on for a while in a series of papers, adding more and more things and following very much Lotka's idea that you should start with the simple models and build up to the complex ones rather than going in the opposite direction. I want to summarize the model for the demography of kin. This has been almost completely published in the human demography literature, although it's has obvious applications to non-human species. So it may not be familiar to theoretical ecologists in general. I'll show a few results of the basic model and then raise the question of stochasticity and present a version that does some stochastic stuff and a few results and some uses of the model, and hopefully have time for questions and discussions and ideas about this. So one way to start thinking about it is that demography in general, whether you're talking humans or not, its task is to link individual life histories with population dynamics. Individuals are born and live and age and develop and mature and move and get sick and recover. And the rates at which those things happen to individuals going through their life cycle is what generates the dynamics of a structured population. Kinship falls as a kind of an intermediate task. Think of your own family. Your family has a different relationship to you than the population at large, and so it's a thing that's worth looking at in between individuals and populations. The classic theory for demography of kinship was a paper published in 1974 by Leo Goodman and Nathan Kiefitz and Tom Pullum. They figured out how to calculate the expected number of kin of any different kind. And they did this by integrating the crap out of everything that they could think of to integrate survival and fertility and age distributions. I always found it very confusing. So I set out to do a matrix-based version of this because I like that. And the idea that they had that was really the key to the whole thing was to do the calculations relative to a central individual, which I call focal. Focal is an individual, and focal can have children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and focal can have parents and grandparents and great-grandparents, older and younger siblings, nieces and nephews and cousins and aunts. And you can extend, if you want, these all of these branches of this network as far as you feel like this is the one that I have been using. And so the key is to recognize that the kin of focal are a population. This is a population of a bunch of my kin at a family reunion about 5 years ago. I'm in the back somewhere. This is a population. It changes because individuals get old. You can see there's an age distribution in this gathering of these kin. Individuals die. Several of the people in this picture are no longer alive. And new kin are recruited by births from other kin, and several of the people in this picture have added new kin to the kinship network of me. So we're going to model them as a population. And the model that ends up is really quite simple. These kin nodes in this graph all have letters on them, and I use those letters as a symbol for an age distribution vector of that kind of a kin. And I purposely left the letter K out so I could use it for a generic kin. So for any type of kin, we have an age distribution at age X of focal. We start watching focal when she's born, and we see what happens to the age distribution of any type of her kin. So the age distribution at age X plus 1 of focal, those kin come from two places. One is the survival of the kin that focal had at age X. U here is a survival matrix with survival probabilities on the subdiagonal, plus the recruitment of kin. The kin population is like barnacles on a rock. The recruitment doesn't come from the barnacles on the rock. The recruitment comes from somewhere else. So when the children of focal have children, those don't produce more children of focal, they produce grandchildren of focal. And so for each type of kin, you can write the recruitment with a fertility matrix times an age distribution of some other kind of kin, K star here, except sometimes there's no recruitment. So for example, focal is not going to recruit any new mothers in this model. So it's either zero or it's fertility applied to a source population that produces new kin. And since it's a dynamical system, you have to specify an initial condition giving the age distribution of each type of kin at the birth of focal. And means you can write down the entire model in a table like this. This is just for age classified version of the model. I'm not going to go into all of those details. I want to show a little bit about what this model does. So I'm fond of using as an example the demographic transition in Japan. Between 1947 and 2019, things changed dramatically in Japan. In 1947, Japan had pretty high fertility, a total fertility rate, mean number of children per woman over a lifetime of 4.6. By 2019, Japan has one of the lowest fertility rates in the world at an average number of children per woman of 1.3. For reference, demographers use a rule of thumb of 2.1 as the number of children per woman required to maintain a population, keep it from declining. And life expectancy increased from a relatively low 54 years to one of the highest life expectancies in the world of 87 years. So two very different demographic regimes in Japan. If you use the model and apply the mortality and fertility schedules of Japan. This shows you on the x-axis the age of focal, on the y-axis the mean numbers of children and grandchildren on this slide. Under 1947 rates, you can see that focal starts accumulating children around just before age 20 and shoots up relatively rapidly to having an average of almost 4 children. And then the number of children that focal has falls off quite rapidly because of the low survival under 1947 rates. Under 2019 rates, focal begins accumulating children more slowly, only goes up to about little over 1. That number of children maintains and then drops off more slowly because of the higher survival in 2019. Grandchildren shows the same pattern, but even more extreme. The number of grandchildren goes up to about 12 compared to 4, goes up to a little bit less than 1. And you can do this for parents and grandparents and compare basically the kind of life in relation to kin that an individual would have at any given age under these two different demographic regimes. By the time focal gets to be age 40, under 1947 rates, on average, she'll have about 1 living parent. Under 2019 rates, about 1.75 living parents. It's my experience that anytime anyone, anywhere ever presents a theoretical ecology or demography presentation, they get the question, but what about, and then some thing which might be interesting. So this particular body of material started off simple with an age classified, time invariant, deterministic, one sex model for living kin. And then these are all published in the journal Demographic Research as this numbered series because I thought that would be fun to do. There's a stage classified version. There's a time varying version. There's a 2-sex version. There's a version that includes dead kin and the bereavement that happens when kin die. Talking today about the stochastic version, there's a version that looks at the overlap with different kinds of kin, which is currently submitted and exists as a preprint on bioRxiv if you're really interested. I've tried to be careful to phrase all of the previous results in terms of means because they are average numbers of kin, average age distributions, expected values, whereas in fact, all of the processes that generate those are stochastic. Survival of an individual is a sequence of stochastic events. Reproduction is a sequence of stochastic events. Every individual may produce a different reproductive history over its life. Its life may be long or short, even though individuals are experiencing the same demographic rates. This means that population growth is a random process. And this kind of thing is referred to as demographic stochasticity. And population biologists often ignore it on the grounds that if the population is large enough, it doesn't matter because the variation among individuals gets averaged out. Thank you very much, law of large numbers. But the population of different kinds of kin are small. The law of large numbers here is not your friend. And just think of your own relatives, how many grandchildren, how many siblings, how many cousins do you have? And the numbers are not very big. So we need to find a way to incorporate that kind of stochasticity into the model. Because of the restriction, the importance of it in small populations, population biologists typically think of it as being important for the success of a newly invading population, a newly introduced epidemic, a newly introduced mutation, a population of conservation concern that's on the brink of extinction. And we can add kinship networks to this list of things. The classic model, everybody here probably knows this, the classic model for demographic stochasticity is the Galton-Watson branching process. Dates from the 19th century and was inspired by the obviously critical problem of the extinction of the surnames of male lineages in England. It has no structure. It's just individuals making copies of themselves, male Englishmen making copies of themselves in form of male offspring carrying their name. These kinds of models have been analyzed a lot. And the basic machinery is to start with the probability distribution of the number of offspring and take a probability generating function of that random variable. And you want the probability distribution of the numbers, and you have there would be a probability generating function for that. And there's a recursive formula to get the probability generating function of the distribution of numbers from the previous distribution of numbers and the distribution of numbers of offspring. Basically gives you three kinds of results. One is the probability distribution of the number of individuals, except to do that, you have to actually be able to work out this recursive probability generating function thing, and you can, as near as I can tell, essentially never do that. So can't get away with that. But you can calculate relatively easily the moments mean the variance of the number of individuals, and you can calculate the probability that a lineage eventually goes extinct also pretty easily. But this is not the probability, the stochastic model that we are looking for, because we have multiple types. We have age distributions of kin, which means that it's not just Englishmen making copies of themselves. It's individuals in each different age class making copies of themselves into other age classes or stages or whatever the individual state variables are. And you end up with, again, generating functions for distributions, but now these things are matrix valued probability generating functions of vectors, and it gets even worse. The theory for that, interestingly enough, a bunch of it came about at Los Alamos during the Manhattan Project, where the things making copies of themselves were neutrons. And the question was whether the population of neutrons would grow, in which case you have a population explosion in a literal sense, or whether the population of neutrons would die out. And when I saw the movie, I kept waiting for them to talk about multi-type branching processes, but they didn't. So once again, we can get the moments and we can get extinction probabilities. And the moments turn out to be useful for us. So we can make a stochastic model for the kinship dynamics that incorporates all of this kind of stochasticity. So we're going to enlarge the vector or type K of kin. First, we're going to put here the expected value. That's the thing that the deterministic model calculates. And then here we're going to take the covariance matrix, which we have vectorized by stacking the columns one on top of the other. Just put that under here. So if there's 100 age classes, like there are in Japan, then you have 100 expected age classes and 10,000 covariance. And so it's a big vector, but that's okay. And skip over that one. And there's a paper which I have gone back to in doing this and decided was quite remarkable by an Australian demographer named J.H. Pollard in 1966, in which he developed a model for demographic stochasticity in population projections. And it's a relatively easy extension of it to come up with this model for the kinship network. So here's our extended vector of the means and all the covariances at age x plus 1. And this matrix, this block structured matrix, this upper left corner projects the expected kin by the, in this case, the survival matrix. And the lower right corner projects the covariance matrix from one time to the next with the Kronecker product of that matrix times itself. This matrix is a matrix that maps the variance and covariance created by the movement of the stages within the from the movement of individuals among the stages in the expected value. This is the fertility term. It has the same form, matrix F multiplied by the expected value. The Kronecker product of F with itself maps the covariance matrix forward through reproduction. If you write this, just simplify the notation and put a tilde over things to let you know that they include both the means and the covariances, you get exactly the same form that we had before. The survival and transitions of the kin at the previous age and the recruitment coming from the appropriate other type of kin, or the possibility of no recruitment if it's a type of kin that doesn't get any new recruits. The matrices and vectors are big, but they're not unpleasantly big. Lots of them are sparse, so that helps if you want to calculate these things. The last time I timed it, it took, I think, something like 7 seconds to calculate the entire kinship network for the case of Japan on a very ordinary laptop computer. So it's not a computationally difficult thing to do. So there's another thing that arose in the course of writing this, which I found interesting. We're not usually interested in the entire age distribution of some type of kin. It's too much information. So all the graphs I was showing before were numbers of kin, add up over the age distribution. But there may be other interesting kinds of outputs that you would want to calculate. Many of them are a linear transformation of the kin vector, with some matrix W doing the calculations, so weighted numbers of kin or numbers of kin in particular age classes. And in that case, this output variable, the expected value of it is just that transformation applied to the expected value of the kin. And the covariance is this quadratic form of the covariance matrix or the kin. And so if you vectorize that, you can create an extended vector for this output, which includes the average and also now includes the variances and covariances among the elements of that output vector. If the so it's much like what you see in linear system theory, where there'll be an equation for the dynamics of state variable and an equation for output variables. I want to finish by showing a few examples of what this looks like when you actually do the calculation. This shows, again, for Japan in 1947 and 2019, the solid line is the mean. The blue line with the little circles on it is the variance, and the red line is the standard deviation, the square root of the variance. For children and for grandchildren, there's quite a lot of variance, and the variance is quite close to the mean. For some kinds of kin, like grandchildren, the variance is effectively identical to the mean. And that continues to be the case for all the other kinds of kin, except for direct ancestors, parents, grandparents, and great grandparents, which are the variance is much smaller than the mean, and so this is compatible with the idea that the distribution of these numbers of kin is actually Poisson. And if you're willing to go with that, and people have in the past for things like this in demography have just assumed a Poisson distribution without having any evidence for it. But if you're willing to buy that assumption, then you can calculate prediction intervals. You can calculate the uncertainty around the average. So if you had a big population of newborn baby focal individuals and followed them through their lives, they would have some number of children, grandchildren, and so on at each age, but there would be some distribution around that, and you would have some amount of variability. So this shows the black line again is the mean, and the blue line is the 90% interval, and the red line is the 50% interval, the interquartile range, basically. And you can see that there's quite a lot of variability. On average, a 40-year-old focal individual under 1947 rates has about 4 children, but in fact, 90% of those individuals have between 1 and 7 children, the distribution in between there. For some types of kin, it doesn't look that much. Here's nieces and nephews of focal, and the average goes up to about a peak of about 15, with a 90% interval between about 19 and about 7. And so you can do this with a stochastic version of lots of interesting outputs. One of the particularly interesting one, a couple of them that I'll mention. One is prevalence of conditions. Um, uh, Prevalence of things like cancer or dementia among relatives have a big impact on people's lives. And the it's been common practice to calculate that by taking the number of individuals and multiplying it by the fraction that have the condition and getting the number of individuals that have the condition. But that ignores the fact that not everybody has the same number of kin, and the having or not having the disease is a stochastic event in itself. And so I go to some length in the paper about this in calculating the contribution of stochasticity, the prevalence of conditions. Lately, so there are some examples of how the kinship model can be used, which I'll very briefly mention to finish up. A paper by some people from the UK, Ellis and other people, used the kinship model to address the question of why menopause exists in toothed whales. They're one of the few animal groups other than humans that have this. And what they found was that in a comparative study, the toothed whales have demographic patterns that give them old individuals having more kin than is the case for other kinds of whales. And their argument is that that provides more of an opportunity for post-reproductive females to help out their kin because they have more of them to help. So that it could be an inclusive fitness argument for why menopause should exist. This is a paper that I did with some people at the Max Planck Institute for Demographic Research, where we looked at the kinship patterns in every country of the world over time, and in the past, starting in 1950 up to 2023, and then in the future using United Nations projections of future demographic rates. And there's a big and very concerning to demographers and social scientists decline in the number of kin. This graph just shows the number of kin summed over all the possible relatives of a woman age 65. And you can see that countries had differed in where they were at the start of this calculation, and they're all crashing downward. This was with the deterministic model. One can wonder what it would be like with a stochastic version. And then finally, I'll mention this one. Jasper Kroll, who was a postdoc with me in Amsterdam, did this calculation. In the basic model, all of the types of kin do their thing independently of each other. That's not always the case. And in elephants, there's data that shows that mothers have a positive effect on the survival of their calves. Sisters have a positive effect on the fecundity of their sisters. And there's a positive effect of the age of the matriarch in the social group on the juvenile survival within the group. So having an old, and we can anthropomorphize and say an old, wise matriarch in your social group is good for you. Poaching obviously has a negative effect on population growth because it kills elephants. But conservation biologists have conjectured for a long time that it also has negative effects because of disrupting the social structure of the kinship network in the social groups. Apparently, mature female elephants are a prize target because they have big tusks. So this shows on the y-axis population growth rate, on the x-axis poaching pressure. The lines go down because poaching kills elephants. The blue line is just without taking into account any of those kin interactions. The yellow line includes the effect of sisters, the red line, the effect of mothers, the purple line, the effect of matriarchs. And then if you include all of them, you get this lowest line. So the difference between here and here is a measure of how much extra danger of reducing the growth rate below replacement you have due to kinship effects on within the elephant kinship network. I think that's it. Yes, that's it. Let me okay.
Thank you so much.
Okay, now I have to speak back.
Did you show something or
questions, comments?
yes, exactly. So if somebody has a question, please raise your hand in the participant list, and I will call on you. Any questions?
Told you.
Yes. Oh yeah, Tulja.
Yeah, nice talk. Thank you for laying this out. One question I had was, have you or do you know of any applications of this in epidemiology? Because a long time ago, there was a paper by Kendall. This was maybe in the 50s or something, when he was thinking about branching processes as a model for epidemics. And his point was that we don't see a lot of epidemics simply because, you get some kind of initial outbreak and then it just goes extinct on you. And so you don't really recognize it, as it were. And when you start looking at the extinction probability in those kinds of situations, a lot depends on variability, which of course has a lot to do with how it spreads and, contact between individuals and so on. So, and you alluded to, how this might be analyzed, but I've never actually seen much application of this kind of thing. And the mathematical literature is not particularly illuminating on this point.
I'm glad to hear you say that. To answer the question of do I know of applications to epidemiology, I do not. I've seen papers that have talked about branching processes in epidemiology. Probably maybe seen Kendall's. There was a guy named Bartoszynski who there was a paper in one of the Berkeley symposia on mathematical statistics. What I have certainly not seen is anything that uses this in the context not just of an epidemic being introduced into a population, but being introduced into a population structured by kinship types. Would be cool.
Thank you. Other questions?
Geza.
Yeah. So the life of an individual depends on the kinship structure. For instance, the survival of the baby depends on the grandmother. But when you calculate all of these things, you use a kind of standardized demography for the individual, if I understand you correctly. So when
Yeah.
you calculate the kinship network and you calculate the number of offsprings of your offsprings, you will not take into account whether these grandchildren have a grandmother or not, something like this.
That's correct. The basic model is basically it's asserting that these individuals are all subject to the same demographic rates. Those rates might change over time, but
Yes.
as they change, everybody is subject to them. In the elephant example that I mentioned at the end, Jasper Kroll had to work kind of hard to figure out how to account for what would happen as the numbers of sisters were reduced, and allowing that to feed back onto the fecundity of the focal individual. Basically, assuming that it was a very well mixed kind of effect. I think that the issue boils down to the thing that Hans Metz and Odo Diekman and other people have talked about for a long time, that there's a requirement in these kinds of structured population models that all of the individuals are experiencing the same environment, so that they can be broken up into age classes or stages or sizes, whatever you want, but within an age class or within a stage, everybody's experiencing the same rates. And when you attempt to include the kind of thing you're talking about, that's no longer the case, and then you end up with interacting particle systems or interacting individual models, which is a way to get at that, but it's a very different kind of population model.
Yes, exactly. This is the reason why I'm asking, because I work exactly with these people, and I learned this. And in real life, for instance, for plants, it is very important that plant individuals affected by the neighboring individuals instead of the population, and the neighboring individuals, at least. Many of them are the relatives of the focal individuals, so it's a very mixed problem, and I'm not sure how to handle it in a general level.
Neither am I. But there is an interesting I think there's an interesting direction to be explored about the interaction between neighbors and how that our understanding of that changes if you account for the fact that neighbors may be different sorts of relatives of you. One of the variables that's definitely not in this model is anything about proximity of things. Demographers worry about, to what extent do people live in the same household, in the same neighborhood, in the same town, in the same city, in the same country. But that's not, at this point, is not in the model.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there any other questions? Well, people are thinking maybe I will ask some questions. Let's see, maybe I'll be moving backwards. So you mentioned when you were you mentioned that because the variance was equal to the mean, one can make the assumption that this is a Poisson process and then draw those quantile intervals around the mean. But wouldn't your model allow you to just actually calculate them without the assumption of Poisson? And if so, how would that compare with you do obtain with a Poisson assumption?
As far as I know, the answer is no. You can't calculate that from this model because this model gives you the mean and the variance. If you wanted, you can carry those matrices that have those Kronecker products in them. You can carry it to higher moments. You can do the third moments, and everything just gets big. But no matter how many moments you do, that doesn't determine the actual distribution. So the best that you can do from information about the means and the variances is to decide whether it seems reasonable to think that this is a Poisson distribution or not. And that's in no way does it prove that it is a Poisson distribution.
Could one do a stochastic version of the matrix model with actual individuals simulated?
Yes, that you could do. You can do individual-based simulations, and you would get an actual distribution. I've done some of those, and they look a lot. The averages of those look a lot like the averages of the deterministic model, but I haven't explored that in any detail yet.
Okay. I'm just wondering is it interesting to look at the quantiles and compare them with the Poisson quantiles?
I think it can be interesting. Partly or particularly interesting if the distribution turns out to be weird.
Yes.
The Poisson distribution is a nicely non-weird distribution, right? It looks, but what if the distribution was, some strange multimodal thing, and you could put the you could associate the weirdness of the distribution with some process that you could then understand. In that case, it would be really interesting. Tolja has done something like that for I think he has logged off, but a recent paper from Tolja and collaborators presented a way in the quite different context of lifetime reproductive success. Instead of just calculating the moments, which I've worked on, Steve Elner has worked on, Tolja has worked on, lots of people have worked on, he came up with a really cool way to calculate the whole distribution. And it turns out that there is, in many populations of many kinds of organisms, a weirdness in that distribution. There's a big peak at 0 that results from individuals that have absolutely no reproductive output during their lives. One way that this happens is individuals that die before they reach reproductive maturity. So there's an example of a thing in the distribution that you can explain. So if we could do that for these models,
I had one more question, which is more a clarification slash my own confusion probably. But when you were showing this model, where you're modeling the average and large vect covariance, so is that and that you're projecting it forward in time, right? So does that mean that we're reaching some sort of stationarity? And were the results that you were showing stationary solutions, or no, that's sort of whatever, we start from a prescribed initial condition and we look at it?
Uh, the um, the kinship model, the way that we tend to think about it, um, is all transience. Focal is born. Focal's going along, living her life. Eventually, she accumulates some average number of children and grandchildren. She has cousins and all these things. But her life doesn't continue indefinitely. And so you don't have the opportunity to have a stationary or ergodic or long-term result of this. You could, because focal doesn't live forever, but you could do a calculation where you basically let focal live forever, in which case the calculation is not the kinship network at age X of focal, but the kinship network X years after the birth of focal. So you can, for example, go on to online and find websites devoted to the descendants of Queen Victoria, because this is of interest to a bunch of people, apparently. And Queen Victoria is no longer alive. Queen Victoria's children are no longer alive, but there's been sort of an ongoing, I actually don't know if it's grandchildren or great grandchildren, and of course cousins and grand nieces and nephews. There's a paper that I've seen, but I have not actually read, but I really should, that claims to have found that a huge number of people, big fraction of the world, are descendants of Genghis Khan.
Yeah, I heard that. I don't know if it's urban legend or not, but maybe
Yeah.
there's serious evidence for that. No, as for Queen
but
Victoria,
still, I still don't think that you get stationary or ergodic kind of
no,
result,
I think I
because
was.
focal dies, her children die, her grandchildren. It's like they come and they go, and they come and they go.
I'm sorry. No, I think I was superficial in looking at your equations because you had x plus 1, but x here doesn't mean time as in a population model. It means the age
The
of
age of focal, as she's
exactly. So okay. Then of course, yeah. So then the point is to project this forward as long as we believe the focal has a chance to live, or do the Queen Victoria thing. Okay. No, I see that. By the way, I think Emperor William II was a grandchild of Queen Victoria already, and he died when? 41?
something like that.
Something like that. So not that it matters to anyone anywhere, but I think we're well beyond grand and even maybe great grandchildren. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. Thank you. That clears it up in my head. Are there any other questions? There are no more questions, then thank you so much again, Hal, for coming and talking to us. And thanks everybody else also for coming. We'll be back in 2 weeks. Uli Brose is going to be giving a presentation, so we all hope to see you there. So thank you again and have a great rest of your day. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.